Welcome back to Silicon Wafers. Tonight we're in Brussels, breaking down the comments of a pusillanimous and pathetic excuse for a leader that's holding the financial keys to a war he claims can't be won. Yet he is not prepared to take a risk for the sake of Ukraine's or Europe's freedom. It's clowns like this that will destroy the European project and contribute to shattering of the peace on the continent. Before we jump in and excoriate the Belgian Prime Minister, let's have a quick reminder. Thank you so much to everyone who supports the channel through Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. It has been absolutely instrumental in helping us to run so many events this year and do so many interviews. I'm immensely grateful to all your support and look forward to that support through the next year. Ukraine is still fighting and we still need to keep going with the informational war as well. Now let's jump into the story. Belgian Prime Minister Bart de Wever has just told the world that who seriously believes Russia is going to lose in Ukraine? It's a fable, a total illusion, not even desirable for Russia to lose. Well, this is quoted in the Kyiv Post. I wonder if he speaks Russian. If not, he better start learning it quickly. And he's refusing to move first on using the Russian central bank's frozen assets, the single biggest pot of war money sitting inside the EU, unless the rest of Europe shares his risk. While on the risk sharing, he has a point, but on the inevitability of Russian victory, he's showing his weakness, his ignorance, and his lack of moral and political courage. Tonight's episode is about two things: why his demand for risk sharing isn't crazy, and why his fatalism about Ukraine is obscene, morally, strategically, and in fact is a betrayal of Belgium's own security, as well as that of Ukraine and Europe. Let's start with the line that detonated across Ukrainian and European social media in an interview with the Belgian newspaper La Libre, relayed in detail by the Kyiv Post and Ukrainian and Polish outlets. De Wever said that seizing Russia's sovereign funds would be unprecedented, complained of incredible pressure on Belgium, and then dropped this bomb. Who seriously believes Russia is going to lose in Ukraine? It's a fable, a total illusion, not even desirable for Russia to lose if it means instability in a country with nuclear weapons. Now, do I even have to point out that this is the very essence of Russian reflexive control? He added that Moscow has warned Belgium that if the EU moves ahead with asset seizures, Belgium and he personally would feel it for eternity. Again, reported in the Kyiv Post. But rather than facing these threats like a man, like a leader, he has crumbled like a wet chocolate cake. In case there was any doubt, he doubled down in other comments. Russia will not lose the war, and the idea that it will is a fairy tale. That's quoted in TVP World. The head of government of the country that hosts Euroclear, the clearinghouse sitting on roughly two-thirds of Russia's frozen central bank reserves in the G7 system, is now publicly echoing one of the Kremlin's core information war narratives, that Russian victory is inevitable and that a real Ukrainian win would be too dangerous to contemplate. Well, before we go to town on this insipid and cowardly politician, let's lay out some of the numbers. After the full-scale invasion in 2022, around $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves were frozen by the G7 and partners. About 210 billion of that is in the EU, and roughly 180 to 185 billion of that is parked at Euroclear in Brussels. That's according to the Kyiv Independent. The European Commission's latest idea is so-called reparations loan, raise about 90 billion euros for Ukraine's 26 to 27 budget by borrowing against those frozen Russian assets to be repaid eventually from war reparations once Moscow loses and pays up. That's from AP News. This is not formal confiscation of Russian assets. It's a giant advance on hypothetical future reparations structured through a special purpose vehicle so that lawyers and central bankers can pretend that property rights are still intact. As one Brussels-based strategist at the Brussels Institute for Geopolitics put it, these assets have become a poisoned chalice for European politics, irresistible as a funding source, but legally radioactive. That's reported in Big Europe. The European Central Bank has already told Brussels it wants no part of this. It refused to act as a backstop, warning that using frozen Russian central bank assets as collateral for public borrowing could undermine confidence in the euro and violate the ban on monetary financing. That's from Financial Times. But you know what could really undermine confidence in the euro? A fucking invasion and occupation of European territory by Russia's rapist army. Well, I don't know if they're really thinking about that, but they're certainly making that scenario far more likely. Belgium is the country that would be sued first if the legal theory goes wrong. Euroclear's boss, Valérie Urbain, has warned that mishandling the assets could trigger investor lawsuits, Russian retaliation, and even potential bankruptcy for a systemically important financial institution. That was reported in Le Monde.fr. But as has been pointed out by Timothy Ash in a recent episode on this channel, Russia would have to waive its sovereign immunity in order to sue, and it would therefore open itself up to massive lawsuits due to the criminality of its activity, the Grey Fleet, the kidnapping of children, the innumerable war crimes it has committed. They have not waived that sovereign immunity yet in 4 years of full-scale war. There is a very, very low likelihood that they would do that in future. But de Wever's position in its narrowest form is brutally simple. He told a domestic outlet that Belgium will not stake its entire financial system on this. We're not going to risk hundreds of billions on Belgium. Not today, not tomorrow, never, he told Brussels Signal. When he says, I want the other 26 EU states to share the legal and financial risk, or I will block this, that is not inherently unreasonable. In fact, plenty of economists and legal scholars have said that if Europe is going to cross this Rubicon, then risk sharing and a watertight legal framework are essential. Again, quoted from Big Europe. My question here, though, is, wasn't this obvious from the start? Don't all European leaders understand this? Of course they do. And if they were serious about helping Ukraine, they're not, and themselves with this security and financial nightmare, wouldn't they have started this process of trying to seize the assets with some form of backstop or collective risk sharing in place? Because this risk sharing argument is solid. The Russian victory is inevitable argument is absolutely not. Where de Wever crosses a line is not in asking Europe to share the burden, it's in adopting the Kremlin's psychological script. On the very week when Russia's Duma is threatening Belgium and Euroclear with retaliation if a single cent is seized, and Dmitry Medvedev is calling any EU move a potential casus belli, a justification for war, the Belgian Prime Minister responds by publicly validating the narrative that Russia cannot and should not lose, not under any circumstances. That's from Reuters. What does Russia do in the very same week? As the peace process moves forward, apparently, though it's not clear how this can happen without a compliant Russia, in the same week, Putin has threatened Europe with invasion. Yes, he said exactly that. Of course, he doesn't want to invade, but Europe is pushing him to do it, just like Ukraine did in 2022. He can't help but unleash this violence. It's all somebody else's fault. Well, this is the price of appeasement, dithering, and weakness. All these do not allay the threat from Russia, but rather inflame it. The blatant appeasing words from Belgium are a red rag to a bull, and they are incitement to aggression and invasion. How the lessons of history are forgotten so quickly. For Ukrainians, this is not an abstract debate. The Kyiv Independent spoke to Ukrainian diplomats, MPs and soldiers about Belgium's veto threats. A servant of the people MP, Alexander Merezhka, called de Wever's stance deeply immoral, arguing that he is looking for excuses not to do what justice demands, namely directing Russian state money to the victim of aggression. That's from the Kyiv Independent. And let's face it, the Belgian Prime Minister won't even do this to save his own country. Activist who is familiar to many on this channel, Elena Halshka, pointed out the grotesque double standard. Europe says it defends the rule of law, yet some leaders now effectively argue that nuclear-armed states must enjoy de facto impunity for genocide and war crimes. One Ukrainian diplomat quoted in that piece was even blunter. They argued that Europeans worrying about instability in Russia are missing the real threat, that 1 million brutalized men, including convicts, could return home to a militarized authoritarian state if the army survives intact, and that Finland or the Baltics will be next unless Russia is decisively checked. That's from the Kyiv Independent. Well, deeper militarization of Russia is now the most likely outcome of any potential peace deal. Not peace, but a race to rearm for the next continental war. Meanwhile, Ukraine's budget reality is brutal. Kyiv is spending essentially all its tax revenue on the war. That's over $60 billion next year, and needs external financing just to keep schools, hospitals and pensions running. Without new money, it hits a cash wall around mid-2026. The Kremlin has invested enormous resources in pushing the idea that Russian victory is inevitable, that time is on Moscow's side, and that resistance only prolongs suffering. De Wever just helped them for free, or at least we assume he was doing it for free. Europe's collective failure is not just Belgium's, however. Here's the uncomfortable part. This is not just a Belgium problem, it's a European failure. A sharp Washington Post op-ed this week skewered the EU's hypocrisies on Ukraine, soaring rhetoric about solidarity paired with chronic failure to act at scale. France lectures Washington about the risk of US betrayal, yet remains a huge buyer of Russian-linked energy via backdoor imports. Other member states quietly drag their feet on sanctions, re-exports, or defence spending, and now Belgium is blocking what could be a 2-year funding bridge for Ukraine because it doesn't want to stand alone in court. That's from the Washington Post. De Wever's nuclear fear argument is pathetic, but let's be honest, he's saying out loud what many Western elites quietly think, that a neat, total Ukrainian victory might be destabilizing, that Russia must somehow be managed, not defeated. And behind the scenes, other capitals are using Belgium as a convenient shield. Some are terrified of setting a precedent on sovereign assets, but happy to let Belgium take the heat for this. Brussels Institute analyst Luc van Middelaar describes how, until recently, big states like Germany and France used the very same arguments as Belgium. Defend the euro's reserve currency status, protect property rights, avoid frightening global investors, etc., blah, blah, blah. With US money drying up and budgets stretched, they have, of course, flipped the narrative, leaving Belgium isolated. Again, that's from Big Europe. The Guardian and AP both note that the Commission has tried to meet Belgium halfway with alternative proposals, an EU-backed loan funded by conventional borrowing or a hybrid model using interest on Russian assets rather than the principal sum. Belgium still says no, unless every partner signs up to joint guarantees. That's from The Guardian. De Wever is the face of obstruction, but the deeper indictment is that nearly 4 years into the biggest war in Europe since 1945, the EU still hasn't built a robust, predictable collective financing mechanism for Ukraine that doesn't depend on one small country's domestic politics. If this war is truly existential for Europe, it shouldn't hinge on the legal risk appetite of Belgium's Prime Minister. Well, let's come back to the Russia won't lose claim. On the battlefield, the picture is grim, but not one-sided. Russia has made bloody gains in places like Pokrovsk. Ukraine is stretched short of shells, air defense missiles, and of course infantry, but Russian casualties are absolutely staggering. Its economy is being slowly strangled by sanctions and war costs, and Ukrainian strikes are disrupting oil exports, logistics hubs and refineries deep inside Russia. That's from Understanding War. Every serious military analyst will tell you the outcome is contingent. It depends on that same ammunition, air defense, industrial mobilization, and political will, not on some mystical law of Russian inevitability. Well, that's the point. When the leader of an EU government declares that Russian defeat is a fable, a total illusion, he is not describing reality, he is helping to manufacture that reality. He is entirely complicit in bringing it about. That's from TVP World. Ukrainian voices get this. In that Kyiv independent piece, one activist compares the mood in Western Europe to a prolonged 1938. Endless appeasement, everyone hoping to avoid war by conceding just a little bit more, but secretly longing for the release of 1939, when the tension breaks and someone else does the fighting. Again, that's quoted from the Kyiv Independent. Well, that's exactly what Moscow wants, a Europe that is tired, divided, and increasingly resigned to a managed Russian victory. But will they be so resigned to becoming part of Moscow's sphere of influence, which is a potential outcome of this endless appeasement and weakness? Well, what would a serious grown-up European response look like? On the narrow technical point, de Wever is right that the legal and financial risk of using Russian central bank assets must be shared. Europe should create an EU-wide guarantee scheme or special purpose vehicle in which all 27 member states explicitly underwrite potential liabilities, perhaps with additional backstops from G7 partners who also froze the Russian assets. That's in the Financial Times. Second, the EU should stop pretending that this can be done on the cheap. Even if the reparations loan model proves too risky, a conventional EU-backed grant or loan package of 90 billion over 2 years is perfectly feasible for a 16 trillion euro economy, if leaders are honest with their voters. That's from The Guardian. They should also be honest that the chances of Russia being able to successfully sue Belgium and indeed the European Union is vanishingly small. Lastly, Europe must explicitly reject the narrative of inevitable Russian victory. Leaders from Estonia's Kaja Kallas to British intelligence chiefs have been hammering this point. Putin wants the West to believe that resistance is futile, but that does not make this true. This is from Euronews. Instead of repeating Kremlin talking points, EU leaders should say out loud, Russian defeat is possible, it is desirable, and it is the only outcome that makes Europe safer in the long run.